Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This covers chapter 3 of Tani's book on religion and the rise of capitalism. This is concerned with the Church of England. The major change which took place was the change of thinking of society as a social organism, as parts of one common united whole, to an individualistic conception where everyone is alone on their own in pursuit of their own goals. Now, we are not studying British history for its own sake. Rather, we want to uncover the principles, underlying principles of social change. And there is a theoretical framework that is used for this purpose. And one is that there are exogenous events, things which happen without any control, and these create social change. Different classes of society react in different ways. The social change can alter the power structures, and it can also create and destroy classes. The power relationships which come into existence, they also determine the ideologies and the theories which come to dominate. So these are some of the basic elements of theory that we want to uncover. So in broad picture, an outline of chapter 3 is that there were some drivers which changed new economic conditions. The church resisted these changes, and there was an ideological response, but the forces for change were too strong, and the religious creed was defeated, and a new market creed emerged. The chapter is divided into three sections: the land question, religious theory, and the growth of individualism. So before we proceed, we must realize that this is a very, very complex topic, and many books have been written about it. And we are trying to look at the broad picture, the big picture, to pick up the global trends. Also, importantly, to look beneath the surface of this change to understand the underlying drivers. There are many complex aspects to the change. Most of them we will hold in the background. We will not discuss them or bring them into the picture. We will look at only the key factors which we hope can be generalized from this particular context to broader situations. So we have been through some of the drivers of economic change. Basically, there was economic expansion in Europe. In England, there was peace, agricultural revolution, industrial revolution. So growth of production led to a substantial increase in foreign trade. With this rise in trade and commerce, there was a rising prosperity among the commercial classes, and these commercial classes wanted to have new forms of society in which there would be more room for them. So the increasing power of the commerce, industry, and agriculture sector led to the social changes that we are going to discuss. The rising tide of commerce led to a large number of changes, which we will discuss only a few. But most important was the enclosures movement, which created private land out of common property. There was a shift from agricultural production for food to sheep and wool for export. Because of the rising tide of prosperity, there was commerce came into the picture, and loans and usury became important. The businesses tried to create, the new emerging businesses tried to break through from the old forms which were very constraining, and there was the rise of middlemen who would profit from taking things from the agriculturalists and selling them in the cities. Because of the influx of gold, there were rising prices in Europe, which led to depreciation of pound. And there was a period of religious wars and many other social changes. Now, one of the key elements to understand social change is to look at the social classes. And in England, there were landowners. They were shifting from feudal land ownership, which was basically a matter of prestige and status, to agribusiness, which was to produce maximum amount of product for sale, for profits. Merchants and traders were also beginning to seek profits instead of seeking stable status in society. As a result of the rise of these two classes, the peasants and the craftsmen experienced loss of independence, and they were ultimately converted to laborers. who were forced to sell their lives for money and lose their possibility of independent livelihood. So section 1 is entitled The Land Question, and this is basically about the dissolution of the Catholic Church in England. Henry VIII seized all church properties and basically eliminated Catholic Church and replaced it by Church of England. That led to a vast amount of land becoming available for grabs. The aristocratic elites bought up this land which was available for sale, creating dramatic social change. There was a massive redistribution of power with growth and power of the finance and merchant classes, loss of power for peasants and craftsmen, and also loss of power for the royalty, in the sense that the middle class or the aristocrats, the landowners and the commerce class, gained a lot of power and they could restrain the king. In particular, king needed taxes for revenue, and the parliament was authorized to prevent him from raising taxes. The process of enclosures redefined land rights so as to give and create private ownership of land that was previously common land available to everyone and for social use. People who purchased this land were forced to think of commercial use for this land, in the sense that they needed to make money from their investment. This led to a natural change in attitude from society based on status to a society based on profit. There was strong resistance to this change from the church and also from the state. The church wanted religious stability and the state wanted political stability. The abolishment of the church and the ecclesiastical privileges and the replacement of the educational curriculum was some of the good things that happened in the Reformation, but also because of the private land grabs, which often took public schools and converted them into private institutions. A lot of charity that was channeled through the church was finished, and commons were seized, and this provoked a lot of outrage, but the power was in the hands of the commercial classes. So basically, this chapter records the battle of ideologies which took place between the rising power of the commercial classes, strongly resisted by the church and the state. Instead of accommodating to the new change, the church thinkers rose to the defense of the ancient society, the society that was under attack, and they tried to preserve intact the social structures and the ideological structures, and this was a major mistake. One of the critical elements of the change was the creed of private property, that a person who owns property is entitled to use it completely according to his own desire without any social responsibilities. This replaced older theories of property, according to which property was a trust, and it was to be used for social welfare, and it had to be given to those who needed it, and it was to be used as a service, and if someone used it in a way that was harmful to public welfare, he would cease to be an owner. Helplessness of state and church in face of change is indicated by this prayer of prayer book by Mary, Queen of England, which basically prays that people who acquire the land will behave in a socially responsible way. Instead, they did not have the teeth to implement in terms of laws. The church did not have the moral authority to impose its jurisdiction upon the rising commercial classes. The second section of the chapter is called Religious Theory and Social Policy, and it deals with the aspect of finance, which becomes central when a rising tide of prosperity requires credit all around. Because of the need of credit by all segments of society, one of the central social issues became the issue of usury, how to loan money at interest. Landlord, craftsman, tradesman, cottager, governments, almost everyone needed to borrow money from time to time, and this gave finance a central role in the emerging market society. The concept of usury is not just giving money at interest, it's actually making use of market conditions for personal benefit against social welfare. The battle was waged in the parliament, which prohibited usury, but then about later it was compelled to restore, to allow it. When the church, when the government ceased to control or regulate usury, the church stepped into the void and said that even though it's legal to take usury, it's still not morally right, and the church exercised its privilege to condemn the practice. The churchmen were concerned that even though usury seems favorable or beneficial to all, the end result will be that the money will concentrate in a few hands only, and this is exactly what actually happened. There was an extended battle to try to control the powers of the rising commercial classes. William Laud was a key minister who imposed very strict Puritan type controls on commerce and eventually was executed because of his opposition to the commerce. The commercial classes were able to win regulations for themselves and also to prevent churches from interfering, which basically led to diminishing in the status of the churches and the emergence of the commercial spirit of the age. The third section of the book is entitled Growth of Individualism, and basically it deals with the collision between the teachings of the church about social responsibility, society, cooperation, and the emerging tide of individualism, personal profits, and pursuit of pleasure and power. The economic trends favored the commercial classes. There was a steady growth of capitalism and increase in foreign trade, and in other types of commerce associated with trade, increase in banking and growth of money market. And basically this led to enormous amount of power in the hands of the commercial classes, which ultimately overthrew both religious and political constraints. Markets are beneficial for the rise of economic growth, but harmful to morals. As complex economic problems arose due to changing economic conditions with exchange rates and balance of payments and values of currencies, people started to analyze the mechanical aspects, the causal aspects, instead of imposing moral judgments on what should be done. Also, it became clear to many that imposing moral solutions was bad economics. It would not lead to the desired ends once the causal mechanisms were under study. With this shift, the market ethic came into its own, and the idea that why should anyone give money if he cannot make benefit from it? This sentiment was not voiceable in the age of dominance of church, but now this became the common sentiment. With the diminution of church authority, the doctrine of natural rights of man, every man has a right to pursue pleasure and wealth and luxury, whatever he wants to do on his own. This came into being. Among the many laws which shows the rising power of the commercial classes, one of them was the prohibition of usury was reversed in Parliament 20 years after the original ruling. With these changes, the commercial classes began to analyze economic theory as a mechanical factor in terms of what happens in the money market, the balance of trade, without any moral considerations. In this rising tide, the divines, the clergy, compromised, and they said that some affairs of business need to be, you need to deal with them according to the specific details rather than provide general moral pronouncements. While the religious divines were discussing what kind of interest is and is not permissible, the whole ground was swept out from under them by saying that religion is not relevant to answering this question. The basic issue which was faced was that moral standards of an organic, closely knit society based on person-to-person contracts, can this morality be extended to impersonal contracts in large groups? Now, the stance of Machiavelli that the political and business world is not subject to morals of private life is really very damaging, but keeping the identical standards of our personal behavior and business behavior and political behavior is also not feasible. To try to maintain too high an ideal led to the abandonment of these ideals and a real politic which simply throws away all moral considerations. So ultimately the failure of the church came about because the theory of business that it had was too stringent and it was not able to accommodate for the needs of business. Another factor which helped in this regard was the Protestant Puritanism, which said that church authorities don't matter, religion is a personal matter. So even though they were not against control of business and they were not in favor of individualism, their weakening of church authority led to unintended rise of individualism. Major political events, civil wars in England, led to this long parliament in which basically the feeling was that it was religion which was causing a lot of warfare, and so another aspect was that the religion should not interfere in secular matters. Church courts previously had power to penalize usurers. All of this was taken away, and basically church was marginalized. Finding its approach to be impractical for the needs of business and also making the church unpopular, the church authorities abandoned the field of business and confined their focus to a smaller domain. This, the limiting the authority of the church to a small subset of areas, was a serious problem, for it left the field of commerce entirely without moral guidance. Religion was replaced by the science of political economy. This was suitable for the age of Newton and science. The inspiration for this was mathematics and physics, and a new theory of political economy based on purely secular ideas was developed by Locke. And one of the critical elements of this new theory was that society was not to be conceived of as an organism, but as a joint stock company in which different elements were partners for their personal benefits. So conceptions of private property, wealth, freedom, all of them changed radically, and the state, instead of being a religious authority, became a matter of convenience, of social contract. In the age of capitalism, the poor were reduced to a factor of production, labor, and since their poverty was essential to enable them to be laborers, to sell their lives for money in miserable conditions, this was taken for granted by many instead of the Christian approach towards sympathy for fellow man. The necessity of poverty was part of the ideology of capitalism. So there was a complete reversal of relationship between the religion as the master interest of mankind, which governed all other domains, to the new position where religion was just one special interest, and the dominant interests in the fields of commerce and society were governed by social laws and social contracts which had nothing to do with religion. In this new emergent theology, the natural order created by supposedly natural laws and the pattern of physics was also benevolent, beneficent. And this is summarized by the doctrine of the invisible hand, where everyone acts for his own personal benefit, and this leads to the best social outcomes. As a consequence of this change, religion itself was marginalized to some spiritual welfare and other domains outside the mainstream of life. Ultimately, Tawney concludes that the church failed to give guidance to emerging forces of capitalism because it had no guidance to give. In this part, we have been concerned to summarize the arguments of Tawney without much additional comment, but from an Islamic perspective, it is very important to note that basically commerce emerged in 16th century Europe and Christianity was unable to handle the changes. This is in dramatic contrast to Islam, which had business as part of the religion from the beginning and therefore managed a massive, vast empire of business interests completely within the laws of the Sharia.